Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Sandra had always been a girl with dreams bigger than the small world she grew up in. The only child of a struggling but determined single mother, she learned early that life did not hand out happiness easily. Her father had died when she was just 4, leaving behind a void that her mother, Evelyn, tried desperately to fill. But life was cruel in ways a child could not yet understand. Evelyn was strict, firm, and sometimes distant, pushing Sandra to excel in her studies, as if it were the only way to keep them afloat. And in many ways, it was. Their tiny apartment barely held warmth in the colder months, and their meals were often simple, but Evelyn never let her daughter see the full weight of their struggles. Instead, she built her up, piece by piece, shaping her into the kind of woman who could survive anything. But survival was one thing, love was another. And when Sandra met Jacob in her second year at university, love felt like the one thing she had been missing. Jacob had an easy charm about him, the kind that made people laugh even when the joke wasn't funny. He had a way of making the world seem simple, of turning struggles into small inconveniences, and Sandra found herself drawn to that lightness. He wasn't the smartest in their class, nor the most ambitious, but he had confidence that made up for it. Sandra, who had spent most of her life being cautious and responsible, found herself wanting to borrow just a little of his recklessness. Their relationship started slowly, study sessions that turned into long conversations, stolen glances that turned into lingering touches. And then, suddenly, it wasn't slow at all. The first time she spent the night in his tiny off-campus apartment, she told herself it was just one moment of weakness, a small rebellion against the weight of expectations she had carried all her life. But rebellion comes with consequences, and by the time she realized she had missed her period, it was too late to take anything back. The night she told Jacob about the pregnancy, his expression had shifted in a way that sent ice crawling up her spine. It was as if, in that instant, the boy she had known had disappeared, leaving behind only a stranger. He laughed at first, a short, humorless sound, then ran a hand through his hair, as if trying to shake off the reality of her words. "That's not possible," he said, his voice sharp, almost accusing. "You're sure it's mine?" The words hit her harder than any slap could have. She had expected shock, even fear, but not this. Not rejection. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to remind him of every moment they had shared, but before she could form the words, he was already gathering his things, mumbling something about needing time to think. She waited. Hours turned to days, days to weeks. And then, one day, she learned the truth. Jacob had left. No messages, no calls, not even a note. He had simply disappeared, leaving her with nothing but the weight of her choices. Sandra sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the single cracked tile on the floor that had always bothered her but now seemed insignificant. The world around her felt eerily silent, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for her to break. She pressed her hands against her belly, which was still flat, still unchanged, but inside of her, life was growing, life that she had never planned for, never even considered. The weight of that reality settled deep in her chest, heavier than anything she had ever carried. She had always been the responsible one, the girl with a plan, the girl who never made reckless mistakes. But here she was, 22 years old, a university student with dreams she had nurtured for years, now watching them slip through her fingers. She imagined the whispers that would follow her down the halls if she returned to class with a swollen belly, the quiet judgment in the eyes of her professors, the disappointed sighs of classmates who had once admired her. And worst of all, the look in her mother's eyes, the one she had been dreading since she first saw the 2 pink lines on the test. Evelyn's reaction was worse than Sandra had imagined. There was no shouting, no storm of furious words, only silence, heavy and suffocating. Her mother sat at the small kitchen table, her hands folded so tightly together that her knuckles turned white. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sharp, like a blade cutting through flesh. "You had one job, Sandra," she said, not looking up. "One job." Sandra swallowed against the lump in her throat, fighting back tears. She wanted to explain, to beg for understanding, to promise that she could still fix this. But her mother didn't want excuses. She wanted the daughter she had raised, the daughter who had never strayed from the path she had set for her. And that daughter no longer existed. From that day on, Evelyn was there, but not really. She moved around their apartment in silence, speaking only when necessary. She stopped asking Sandra about school, stopped reminding her to eat, stopped offering the quiet reassurances that had once been a constant in her life. And then, one evening, only a few months later, she was gone. A sudden illness, a fever that came fast and strong, and before Sandra could process the loss, she was alone. Truly, completely alone. The days that followed blurred together, a haze of grief and nausea and exhaustion. Sandra withdrew from university before she could fail out completely. There was no time to grieve properly, no space to fall apart. There was only survival now. She sold her textbooks first, then some of her clothes. She found work where she could, small jobs that barely covered food, let alone rent. Every night she lay awake, her hands cradling the swell of her belly, whispering promises to the life inside her, promises that she wasn't sure she could keep. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave birth alone in a dimly lit hospital room, with no one holding her hand, no familiar voice soothing her through the pain. When the nurse placed the tiny, crying baby girl in her arms, Sandra felt both overwhelming love and crushing fear. She named her Jenny, pressing a kiss to her daughter's soft forehead, knowing that from this moment forward, everything had changed. There was no Jacob, no Evelyn, no future waiting for her in a lecture hall. There was only Jenny, and a world that suddenly felt far too big for a girl who had once thought she had everything figured out. 3 years had passed, and Sandra had learned to live with the weight of exhaustion pressing against her bones. Her days were long, beginning before the sun rose and ending long after it set. She sold fruits at the market, her hands rough from hours of sorting, lifting, and carrying crates of produce. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the life she had, and she had learned not to complain. Jenny was growing into a bright, curious child, full of questions Sandra often didn't have the energy to answer. But no matter how tired she was at the end of each day, she would still pull her daughter into her lap and whisper stories to her, stories of a world beyond their tiny room, a world she still hoped to show her one day. Sandra had built walls around herself, too afraid to trust, too broken to believe in dreams anymore. But then Philip walked into her life, and for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar, hope. Philip was different from Jacob. He wasn't a boy fumbling his way through life. He was a man who seemed to have everything figured out. He owned a business, something in imports and exports, though Sandra never quite understood the details. He carried himself with confidence, the kind that made people stop and listen when he spoke. And most surprising of all, he didn't shy away when he learned about Jenny. Instead, he smiled, ruffled her curls, and asked if she liked chocolate. Sandra had never let herself believe in fairy tales, but the way Philip treated her made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to want more than just survival. He took her to restaurants where the lights were dim and the music was soft. He spoke about a future where she wouldn't have to work so hard, where Jenny could have the best education, where Sandra could be more than just a struggling single mother. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine it. She allowed herself to feel something other than fear. But then came the condition. Philip wanted marriage, but only if Sandra proved she could still give him a child. "It's not that I don't believe you," he said one evening, his fingers tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I just need to be sure. I need to know that we can build a family together." Sandra stared at him, the warmth of his touch suddenly feeling foreign, unfamiliar. Something inside her warned her to run, to step back before she lost herself again. But love is a powerful thing, and the need to belong, to be chosen, to be loved, those things are even stronger. And so, against the voice in her head screaming for caution, she agreed. She let herself believe that this time would be different, that this time she wouldn't end up alone. But deep down, a quiet fear settled in her chest, whispering a truth she wasn't ready to face. What if history was about to repeat itself? Sandra had never known fear the way she did in the weeks after she agreed to Philip's condition. Each morning, she woke with a silent prayer, hoping that this time she wouldn't be left behind. She told herself it was different. Philip was different. He wasn't Jacob. He wasn't the kind of man who would abandon her. He had promised her a future, one filled with stability and love, and she held on to that promise with trembling hands. When the pregnancy test finally showed 2 pink lines, she felt both relief and dread settle deep in her chest. She imagined Philip's reaction over and over in her mind, convincing herself that he would be happy, that he would pull her into his arms and tell her that their life together was about to begin. But when she finally told him, his excitement felt forced, his smile just a little too quick, his embrace a little too brief. A shadow passed behind his eyes, one that she couldn't quite place. He promised her everything was fine, that he just needed time to process, but something in his voice made her stomach twist. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them grew. The texts became fewer, the phone calls shorter. When she tried to see him, he always had an excuse. Business trips, late meetings, unexpected obligations. Sandra tried not to overthink it, tried to push down the gnawing feeling of unease. But the walls around her were closing in, and she could feel the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. One evening, as she sat on the edge of her bed, she decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. She called him once, twice, 3 times, until finally his phone went straight to voicemail. The next morning, she went to his apartment, knocking on the door with shaking hands. No answer. The neighbor, a kind old woman who often sat outside knitting, gave her a sad, knowing look. "He left," she said simply. "Packed up and left 2 days ago. Said he was moving back home, someplace far away." The words didn't make sense at first. Sandra stood there, frozen, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to the woman. "That's not possible." But it was. Reality settled in like a slow, crushing weight. Philip was gone, just like Jacob, just like the life she had once dreamed of. She walked home in a daze, her mind replaying every moment, every conversation, searching for the signs she had ignored. That night, as Jenny slept beside her, Sandra curled around her growing belly and let the truth sink in. She had been used. Again. And this time, she had no more illusions left to cling to. There was no one coming to save her, no one to catch her when she fell. She had let herself believe in love, and in return, she had been left with nothing but the ache of another betrayal. But as tears slipped down her face, she made a silent vow. This would be the last time. Never again would she give someone the power to break her. Never again would she allow herself to be fooled by sweet words and empty promises. She was done hoping. From now on, she would only rely on herself. The days after Philip's disappearance moved in a slow, heavy blur. Sandra carried the weight of her growing belly like a burden, her body aching under the strain of another pregnancy she had not planned for, another child she would have to raise alone. But more than the physical exhaustion, it was the emotional numbness that consumed her. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't hurting, but because she had nothing left to grieve. Pain had become familiar, abandonment and expectation rather than a shock. Each morning she forced herself to rise, to carry on for Jenny's sake. But the world felt smaller now, colder, pressing in on her like an invisible force determined to suffocate her. Her market stall became her only refuge, the mindless act of arranging and selling fruit the only thing that kept her from thinking too much. Customers came and went, faces blurring together as she counted coins with hands that trembled from exhaustion. The days stretched into weeks, and still she heard nothing from Philip. No messages, no explanations, just silence, thick and unforgiving. Sandra's body grew weaker as her pregnancy advanced, the stress of working long hours under the sun taking its toll. Some days she felt dizzy just standing for too long, and yet she had no choice but to keep going. There was no one to turn to, no family left to lean on. She had lost her mother, lost her education, and now she had lost the one person who had promised her stability. Her apartment was barely livable, the roof leaking when it rained, the walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing late into the night. Jenny, ever the curious child, had begun to notice her mother's weariness. "Mama, are you okay?" she asked one night, her small hands pressing against Sandra's face, as if she could fix whatever was broken inside her. Sandra forced a smile, brushing Jenny's curls from her forehead. "I'm fine, baby," she whispered, though the words felt like a lie. She wasn't fine. She was barely holding on. Then, one ordinary afternoon, as Sandra rearranged oranges in her stall, fate intervened. A voice, familiar yet distant, called her name. She turned slowly, her heartbeat stuttering, as she met the gaze of a man she hadn't seen in years. Uncle Raymond. He stood there, his expression a mixture of shock and sorrow, as if he were staring at a ghost from his past. She hadn't seen him since she was a child, before life had taken everything from both of them. And yet here he was, in the middle of the bustling market, looking at her like he could see all the years of struggle written across her face. His eyes dropped to Jenny, then to the swell of her belly, and something in his expression shifted. Without hesitation, without judgment, he stepped forward and said the words that would change everything. "Come home with me, Sandra." And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone anymore. Sandra hesitated before stepping into her Uncle Raymond's house. It was larger than she remembered, though time had likely distorted her childhood memories. The walls were painted in soft, muted colors, the furniture arranged with careful precision, yet there was an emptiness to the space, as if it had been frozen in time. Raymond had lost his wife and son 3 years ago, a tragedy Sandra had only heard whispers of. Now, standing in the doorway of the home they had once filled, she could feel the weight of their absence pressing against the air. Jenny clung to Sandra's dress, her wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mama, are we staying here?" she asked in a small voice. Sandra's throat tightened as she looked at Raymond, who nodded slowly. "As long as you need," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. And in that moment, something inside Sandra cracked. After years of struggling alone, she was being given a chance to rest. The first few weeks were difficult. Sandra wasn't used to kindness without conditions. She found herself constantly waiting for Raymond to ask for something in return, but he never did. Instead, he made space for her and Jenny, helping her settle into a routine that no longer involved waking up before dawn to sell fruit in the market. For the first time in years, she ate meals that weren't rushed, slept in a bed that didn't creak under the slightest movement, and carried a belly that wasn't just a burden, but a life waiting to be welcomed. Jenny thrived under the change, quickly growing attached to her great uncle, who in turn doted on her with quiet affection. Yet, despite the newfound security, Sandra struggled to shake off the past. She had spent so long expecting disappointment that she didn't know how to accept anything else. Some nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was just another temporary illusion, another chapter in a story that always ended the same way. Raymond, sensing her restlessness, brought up the topic she had been avoiding, her education. "You were meant for more than selling fruit on the streets, Sandra," he told her one evening as they sat in the quiet of the living room. "I can help you go back to school. Finish what you started." The words sent a pang of longing through her, but they also terrified her. Going back meant facing everything she had lost, admitting that she had given up too soon. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Raymond didn't push, didn't try to convince her. He only nodded, as if he understood something she couldn't yet put into words. "Think about it," he said simply. "There's no rush." But the seed had already been planted, and for the first time in years, Sandra allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't just surviving, but living. The decision to return to school didn't come easily. Sandra wrestled with doubt, fear, and the lingering shame of her past mistakes. The last time she had stepped into a university classroom, she had been full of dreams, convinced that her path was clear. Now she was a mother of two, her body still healing from childbirth, and the idea of sitting among students who had never known the struggles she had endured made her stomach twist with unease. But Raymond's unwavering support gave her strength. He handled everything, the application process, the necessary documents, even arranging for childcare while she studied. "You're not alone in this," he reminded her when she hesitated, his steady gaze breaking through the wall of insecurities she had built around herself. Eventually, she stopped resisting and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of this second chance. The first day back was overwhelming. Sandra clutched her notebook tightly, feeling out of place among students who chatted excitedly about assignments and weekend plans. She was older now, her experiences having aged her in ways they would never understand. But as the professor began the lecture, something shifted inside her. The familiar rhythm of academia, the challenge of new knowledge, had awakened something she thought she had lost. She took notes feverishly, absorbing every word, determined not to let this opportunity slip away. Her evenings were spent balancing motherhood and coursework, studying late into the night while Jenny slept beside her. Exhaustion was a constant companion, but it was different from before. This time, she was tired because she was building something, not just struggling to survive. As the months passed, Sandra began to change. Confidence replaced hesitation, and for the first time in years, she saw a version of herself that she respected. Raymond beamed with pride every time he saw her buried in textbooks, while Jenny flourished under the warmth of their new home. Slowly, the bitterness she had once carried began to fade. She no longer thought about Philip or Jacob with anger, nor did she dwell on what she had lost. Instead, she focused on what she was gaining, a future, a sense of self, a life she could be proud of. And as she turned in her final paper for the semester, she allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming the woman she had always meant to be. Sandra's days became a delicate balance of lectures, assignments, and motherhood. Each morning she woke before the sun, making sure Jenny was dressed and fed before heading off to campus. The exhaustion was familiar, but this time it carried purpose. She no longer felt like a woman drifting through life, waiting for the next disappointment to strike. She had structure, direction, something she hadn't felt in years. Raymond remained her unwavering support, watching over Jenny and her newborn son, Liam, whenever she needed to stay late at the library or meet with professors. His home had become a sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild herself without fear of falling apart. And slowly, she began to embrace the reality that she was no longer the broken girl who had once thought love was the only way to be whole. Yet, even as she moved forward, remnants of her past surfaced in unexpected ways. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in the storage room, she found a faded notebook filled with dreams she had written as a first-year university student. Goals, aspirations, things she had almost forgotten she had once wanted. Her fingers traced the inked words, some pages smudged from time and neglect. Graduate with honors. Travel. Start a foundation for young women. The last line made her pause. Back then, she had been so certain of the path ahead, so sure of who she would become. Life had stripped her of those illusions, reshaping her through struggle and heartbreak. But as she read through her younger self's dreams, she realized that they weren't entirely lost. They had only been buried beneath the weight of survival. And now, she had a choice, to let them stay forgotten, or to fight for them once more. Determined, Sandra took a leap she never thought she would have the courage to make. With Raymond's encouragement, she applied for a scholarship that would allow her to complete her master's degree abroad. The process was grueling. Essays, interviews, waiting for responses that seemed to take forever. But she refused to let fear hold her back. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, she sat in stunned silence, unable to believe it was real. She had spent so long struggling to stay afloat that she had never imagined she would get the chance to soar. Raymond embraced her tightly, whispering how proud he was, while Jenny clapped her hands in excitement, not entirely understanding what it all meant. That night, as Sandra lay awake, staring at the ceiling, she felt something unfamiliar, peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had fought her way out of the darkness, and now she was ready for whatever lay beyond. Sandra's departure for her master's degree felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The moment she stepped onto the plane, with Jenny's tiny fingers gripping hers and Liam nestled in her arms, reality settled in. She was leaving everything familiar behind. Raymond had insisted on accompanying them to the airport, his steady presence a source of quiet reassurance. "You've come so far, Sandra," he had told her before she boarded. "Don't look back with fear, only forward with courage." His words stayed with her during the long flight, echoing in her mind as the city she had known all her life disappeared beneath the clouds. When she finally landed in a country that had once seemed like a distant dream, she found herself filled with a strange mix of excitement and uncertainty. The air smelled different, the streets unfamiliar, the voices around her speaking accents she had only heard in movies. Yet, despite the strangeness of it all, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. Adjusting to her new life was not easy. The demands of her studies were intense, and balancing motherhood with academia pushed her to the brink of exhaustion. Every morning was a battle against time, getting Jenny ready for school, feeding Liam, attending lectures, completing assignments, then returning home to care for her children. Some nights, she stayed up long after the kids had fallen asleep, poring over textbooks while fighting the urge to collapse from fatigue. But no matter how difficult it became, she refused to give up. Each challenge she faced reminded her of why she had come here, to build a future, not just for herself, but for Jenny and Liam. Slowly, she began to adapt. She found a rhythm, learned to ask for help when she needed it, and even made friends who admired her resilience. The more she immersed herself in her studies, the more she realized how much she had been holding herself back in the past. She was capable, intelligent, and deserving of success, things she had once doubted, but no longer questioned. Then, one evening, fate decided to test her once again. As she walked through the university's courtyard, exhausted from a long day, she caught sight of a familiar face, Philip. He was sitting alone on a bench, his posture slouched, his clothes no longer the crisp, expensive ones he used to wear. There were deep lines on his face, and his once confident aura had faded into something hollow. He looked up and met her gaze, his eyes widening in shock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sandra felt no anger, no resentment, only a quiet sense of closure. She walked towards him, her steps steady, unshaken by the past they shared. When he finally found his voice, it was hesitant. "Sandra," he whispered. But she didn't let him finish. She lifted her chin, her voice calm and certain. "I don't need anything from you, Philip. My children have a father now, one who stayed, who cared, who never abandoned them. She watched the words sink in, watched as regret flickered across his face. But she didn't linger. She had nothing left to give to ghosts of the past. Turning away, she walked back toward the life she had fought so hard to build, knowing that this time she was truly free. The encounter with Philip lingered in Sandra's mind, not because she still cared for him, but because it reminded her just how much she had changed. The girl who once craved love, who had been willing to sacrifice everything for a man's approval, no longer existed. She had been replaced by a woman who knew her worth, a woman who had survived heartbreak and betrayal, but had not let it define her. Still, seeing him in such a state made her reflect on how life had unfolded for both of them. She had once believed that she was the one who had lost, the one left behind, but now she saw the truth. Philip had been the one who lost everything. He had walked away from a family, from the chance to be a father, from the love of a woman who had given him her trust. And now he was alone, carrying the weight of his own decisions. Sandra, on the other hand, had built something out of her pain. She had turned her suffering into strength, her regrets into lessons. She no longer carried resentment, nor did she feel the need for closure. Life had already given her all the answers she needed. As the months passed, Sandra focused entirely on her studies, throwing herself into her coursework with determination. Each class, each research paper, each presentation brought her closer to the future she had once thought was lost. Balancing motherhood and academics remained a challenge, but she had learned to navigate it with grace. Jenny adapted well to their new life, making friends and excelling in school, while Liam grew into a joyful, curious toddler, his laughter filling their small apartment with warmth. Raymond called often, always eager to hear about their progress, his voice carrying a pride that never failed to bring tears to Sandra's eyes. He had been the one to believe in her when she couldn't believe in herself, and now she was determined to make him proud. With each passing day, she felt stronger, more certain of who she was becoming. She no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. She was simply living, embracing the opportunities before her, shaping a life on her own terms. Then, one evening, as she sat in the university library, preparing for a major presentation, she met someone unexpected, someone who made her heart race in a way it hadn't in years. Ethan. He was a fellow student, working toward his doctorate, with a quiet confidence and a kindness that stood out in a world often filled with selfishness. The conversations started out simple, discussions about coursework, shared frustrations over deadlines, but soon they deepened. Unlike the men of her past, Ethan never rushed her, never made her feel like she had to prove her worth. He saw her for who she was, not for the struggles she had faced. And slowly, cautiously, Sandra allowed herself to open up again. Love was no longer something she chased. It was something she was finally ready to receive. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, a hope, a possibility. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had learned that real love wasn't about desperation or sacrifice. It was about respect, patience, and the willingness to grow together. And as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she knew, this time, she would never be used again. Sandra took her time with Ethan, allowing their connection to unfold naturally. Unlike the past, there was no rush, no desperate need to hold on too tightly. He respected her boundaries, never pressing for more than she was ready to give. Their friendship grew first, built on laughter shared over late-night study sessions and quiet conversations in the university library. Ethan had a way of making her feel seen, not as a mother struggling to balance her responsibilities or a woman who had suffered heartbreak, but as herself. He admired her mind, encouraged her ambitions, and celebrated her victories, no matter how small. For the first time, Sandra experienced a love that felt safe, one that wasn't built on empty promises or conditions. It wasn't about filling a void or proving anything. It was simply about being with someone who valued her for who she was. Still, opening her heart again was not easy. Doubt crept in at times, whispering that happiness was temporary, that love always ended in pain. But Ethan was patient, never demanding more than she could give. He understood that she carried scars, and never made her feel ashamed of them. Slowly, Sandra allowed herself to trust again. She introduced him to Jenny and Liam only when she was sure, watching carefully as he interacted with them. To her surprise, Ethan embraced them without hesitation, treating them not as burdens, but as an extension of her. He would kneel to tie Jenny's shoelaces, carry Liam when he got too tired to walk, and read bedtime stories with the same warmth and patience she did. Watching him with her children, something in Sandra shifted. She had spent years fearing love, convinced it would always betray her. But now she saw that love, real love, wasn't about suffering. It was about kindness, about showing up, about choosing each other every day. By the time Sandra completed her master's degree, she was no longer the girl who had been abandoned, no longer the woman who doubted her own worth. She had built a life she was proud of, one that was hers and hers alone. When Ethan asked her to marry him, he didn't do it with conditions or ultimatums, only a quiet promise that he would stand beside her, no matter what. And this time, Sandra chose love on her own terms. She said yes, not because she needed someone to save her, but because she had already saved herself. As she stood at the altar months later, looking at the man who had taught her that love could be gentle, she felt no fear. Her journey had been painful, filled with loss and lessons, but it had led her here, to a love she didn't just accept, but one she truly deserved. And as she walked forward, hand in hand with Ethan, Jenny, and Liam, she knew this was only the beginning. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.